Good morning, everyone. It is a cold and snowy one out there this morning. It's good time to snuggle in and listen to a story. And wouldn't you know, I just happen to have a story for you today. And guess what? This is a story that you can follow along with me. And you, um, you don't even have to know what the story is. You can just follow me while I tell it. And you're going to need a couple of things if you're going to follow along in the story with me. Okay, you're going to need your right hand and you will need your left hand. So if you want to follow along with me, you can get your hands out right now. And then we'll be ready to go. Okay, so this is a story about two friends named Mr. Wiggle and Mr. Waggle. And Mr. Wiggle and Mr. Waggle, they lived in identical houses. See their houses right here? Okay. And Mr. Wiggle, he went into his house like this. He opened the door, he went inside, he closed the door. And Mr. Waggle, when he went into his house, he did it like this. He opened the door, he closed the door, or he went inside and then he closed the door. It's kind of how everybody goes into their house, isn't it? And then one day, Mr. Wiggle over here decided he wanted to visit Mr. Waggle. So he opened his door, he came outside, and he closed his door. And then he went up the hill and down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill and down the hill until he got to Mr. Wiggle's house. Oh, sorry, Mr. Waggle's house. This is Mr. Wiggle. I can't tell them apart. They're identical. He knocked on the door. Knock, knock, knock. And he called out, "Oh, Mr. Waggle!" But Mr. Waggle didn't answer because he was baking cookies and he couldn't hear. So Mr. Wiggle knocked a little louder, knock, knock, knock. And then he called out a little louder, "Oh, Mr. Waggle!" But there was still no answer. So Mr. Wiggle, he knocked even louder, knock, 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 and he called out as loud as he could, "Oh, Mr. Waggle!" But there was no answer. So Mr. Wiggle decided to go home. He went up the hill and down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill and down the hill until he got to his house. And he opened his door, and he stepped inside, and he closed the door. And then, well, wouldn't you know it, the very next day, this is Mr. Waggle. See, I can't tell them apart. Mr. Waggle decided he was going to go visit Mr. Wiggle. So he opened his door, and he stepped outside, and he closed his door, and then he went up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill until he got to Mr. Wiggle's house. And he knocked on the door, knock, 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 and he called out, "Oh, Mr. Wiggle!" But wouldn't you know it, Mr. Wiggle was out in his backyard shoveling snow. So he couldn't hear the knock on his door. So there was no answer. And then Mr. Waggle, he knocked again, knock, knock, knock. And he called out again, "Oh, Mr. Wiggle!" But there was still no answer. So Mr. Waggle, he tried one more time, knock, 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 and he called out as loud as he could, "Oh, Mr. Wiggle!" But there was still no answer. So Mr. Waggle decided to go home. He went up the hill and down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill and down the hill until he got to his house. And he opened the door and he went inside and he closed the door. And then guess what? The next day after that, they both decided they were going to go visit each other. So they both opened their doors, they both came outside, and they both closed their doors. And then they went up the hill and down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill, and they met at the top of the hill. And then they saw each other, and they had a great time. They talked to each other about all of the news that was going on, and they shared all of the gossip that they heard from their other friends. They talked about hills because they have to go up and down them all the time, and the ups and downs of life as well as hills. And then when they had said everything they wanted to say, they said goodbye and they gave each other a hug. And then they went up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill until they made it back to their houses. And then they both opened their doors at the same time. And they both went inside at the same time. And they both closed their doors at the same time. And then the next time that they wanted to talk to each other, guess what they did? They used the telephone. Instead of going up and down all those hills, and that is the end of my story. And that one is actually, if you want to learn how to tell it yourself, it's really easy. You can find different versions of it online as well, or you can change the names, you can change what they do once they get to the top of the hill, you can change what they do when they're visiting each other at their houses. You can do whatever you want with that story and tell it in any way that you want, which is pretty fun. So, I hope you enjoyed that story, and I hope you will join me for my next video. Bye!